Direct brain interfaces. This day one panel looked at the different approaches to and technologies for doing direct brain interfaces and the new possibilities they may create. Speaker bios are at futureofinterface.org/bios.
I have with me Vint from Carnegie Mellon University, who may be just a little late on this call. Maryam Shanechi, who is Shanechi. Max Hodak from Science Corp, and Nataliya Kos'myna from the Media Lab, MIT Media Lab, and Nicholas Opie from Synchron. I'm going to let them begin this conversation on direct brain interfaces. Just a couple of comments to make. First of all, I think we've had enormous success with direct brain interfaces for sensory neural interfaces, the cochlear implant being the best example of that, interfacing directly with the auditory nerve and simulating signals that the brain interprets as sound. I think neuromotor interfaces are also likely to be increasingly feasible. But getting deeper into this and into anything that might be considered a cognitive interface, I think is very speculative. But our purpose in this panel is to try to look 20 years ahead to understand where this technology could potentially take us. It's of considerable importance when we speak about accessibility because it might overcome barriers that are caused by physical impairments that in a sense get in between the neural system of the brain and its sensory apparatus and the rest of the body. And so the ability to make more direct interfaces could be dramatically effective at improving accessibility. So I'm going to invite each of the panelists to open with a few minutes, please not too many, of a kind of framing view of where you think we might be in 20 years' time with these kinds of neural interfaces, and a little bit about what the barriers are. And then we'll get into a deeper conversation about how we can make progress in this intriguing space. So I'm going to start with Max Hodak. Max, would you like to make your opening framing remarks, please?
Sure. I have a couple slides, if that's okay to share.
Yeah, as long as you don't go over, for.
I won't. It's just really it's just a couple to frame my thinking. Okay. I'm actually going to. So the hardware for direct neural interfacing is advancing in many different directions very rapidly. There's a somewhat kind of simultaneously practical and feels more speculative problem that I've been thinking about a lot recently that I think might be relevant to discuss, which is we have really good understandings of the programming metaphors for visual and auditory devices, right? You've got a frame buffer, you can write this to a display, like the hardware for this is very well understood. But what is like, we don't really have a sense of like how you would write software for the other senses. And the hardware is getting to a point where this is starting to become practical. And so my view from my vantage point, all of the communication in or out of the brain goes through a handful of cranial and spinal nerves. This is only about 4 million cells total, 3 million of which are in the eyes. There's only about 33,000 hair cells. It's a really compact information bottleneck. And if you can get the cranial and spinal nerves, then the interface is whatever the computer says it is. And this is, I think, a really more practical target for many things than trying to get like these, like a billion or hundreds of millions of cortical neurons. Just like a really quick kind of concrete example is if you look at the retina, there's light shines in from the front, goes through these layers of cells. It's backwards for boring evolutionary reasons in many vertebrates. The representation of the photoreceptors is really simple. It's a bitmapped image because the eye is a camera. And then it compresses down 100x onto about 1.5 million ganglion cells per eye. And the ganglion cells form the optic nerve. The axons of the ganglion cells are the optic nerve. And so in some deep sense to the brain, you've got this like 1.5 million long list of numbers that correspond to the firing rates of the ganglion cells. And if you can set those, you can set vision because that's all the brain really gets. And so down each of these channels, all the brain ever really gets are these spike trains. And so when you look at somatosensation, there's from each dermatome, from each like level of the body, it relays in through a ganglion at a level of the spinal cord and then up into the brain. And so like, what is this a frame buffer? Like very pragmatically, like what does a frame buffer for this look like? Like, is it, you could imagine something like a tensor that's like sensors by general coordinates, where you have like one channel per each type of sensor. You've got proprioceptors, you've got temperature sensors, you've got all kinds of different sensors in the body. How do you think about discretization over this? Like how do I like open PyTorch, or how do I open like GL and like write like a somatosensory frame buffer? And so this is, I think, simultaneously very pragmatic, and also we're getting to the point where the hardware is going to enable us to start doing this in a sophisticated way, especially in animal models. And I think is really unexplored territory from a interface and how do we use this perspective. So those are the slides.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Max, for being so compressed. They're almost as good as the visual system in terms of compression ratios. You've done something interesting when you use frame buffer as a metaphor. There must be something deep about that I'm not quite getting. What is it about the notion of frame buffer that is appealing to you as a metaphor for what else is going on there?
Yeah, well, I don't know that the frame buffer is, I think it might be literally like you have some block of memory that you're going to be updating some state, and then you're going to be writing that out to a stimulating device, right? I think it's literally, it's what is a proprioceptor frame buffer? What does the structure of that look like? Because it's not going to be a 2D 3-channel RGB matrix like tensor like we use for writing to a display, right?
Okay. Yes, and these are all serial pulse trains that effectively.
Yeah.
And it's very important, I think, for us to remember how limited the communication system is inside the brain. I mean, it's a very uniform system, and it's amazing how we are able to interpret that simple signaling mechanism in so many different ways.
Yeah, and it's like there's a really very small number of wires in and out of, like, the processing within the brain is enormously complex, but there's a really fairly small number of wires in and out of the brain.
This is why there's good hope, I think, for sensory neural interactions. Nataliya, let me ask you if you'd like to offer some framing opening remarks.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Great to have all of you here. And actually, in contrast to Max, I would actually like to bring us a bit outside to the consumer world. And I would love to show you actually a bit more complementary image how and what we're going to end up in 20 years from now. So first of all, obviously, the devices we are using right now, screens, computers, they're going to disappear in the current form factor. So everything we have right now, this guy here, your phones, your headphones. I can see almost everyone who is on camera is wearing some type of headphones. Quite a few folks just down the lab here wear masks. All of that will become enhanced with some type of physiological sensing. And because obviously they are head-worn devices, system, support system, protective gear, you name it, they're definitely going to be all enhanced with brain sensing. Non-invasive is definitely still a big pass-through for simple reason. You have much more control over what goes in, what goes out, in the sense of you don't like it anymore, you want to change it, you want to have this upgrade of the system. And acceptability from the consumer, though, that would be, I guess, a big challenge. As of now, I'm pretty sure no one here, at least from folks present, has a system, invasive or non-invasive, that supports them. Very few people do use those on an everyday basis. And as you mentioned, Vint, people who do use them as of today, they do need them for mostly health conditions to support their health conditions. However, we as consumers, we don't have those. We don't use those. Is it because they're not developed? Not really. Is it because there is no killer app that you would use it for? I would definitely argue that that is the case.
Hello, Krista.
Hey, Dean.
Yeah, please go ahead, Nataliya. I think that's just indicating that Bin has joined us, so that's good to know. Thank you. Please go ahead.
So yeah, and that's, I think, something super important. We can see this with EXA, systems as of now, multi-billion industry, multi-trillion industry. No one is really wearing those around unless it's part of your work. Same here. So I would encourage really to think through how we can bring the device and what will happen with the interface itself when it gets closer to the body, and how the interface will significantly change. We see it already with Apple Watch and some type of different, other devices, but how your phone will become, your lens, how the phone will become your pair of glasses that will have the direct communication with your brain, at least to some extent, and how this closed loop system will be enhanced or not to enhance your abilities, your communication, your needs, your performance. That's a completely different question that definitely needs to be answered and tackled.
Fascinating. I keep wondering whether we'll get to the point where our thoughts are being detected by the things that we're wearing. There are some indications that we can tell what you are thinking if you are sub-vocalizing, even though you're not speaking. Signals are going to that would normally control your mouth and chest and so on. And if we can detect those signals, we may actually be able to figure out what it was you were sub-vocally voicing in your head. That's interesting, to say the least, because it might open up a channel of communication for people with disabilities that would otherwise be closed. That's quite exciting.
Yeah, definitely. So vocalization is more based on something called EMG, electromyography. So it's not always accessible for all categories of patients. Just, as a heads up, we're talking about direct brain interfaces and non-direct brain interfaces. There's like a lot of discussions there, but definitely there's a lot of opportunities that, again, prototypes are already readily available, and they are available for, for a wider range of different, categories of users. The question is, are you going to just walk around with a sub-vocalizer system, hanging from your jaw? How are you going to use it, in which use cases, and why? That is a question.
Well, we're going to find out. Nicholas, could I call on you for your opening framing remarks as well, please?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. So I think it's a fantastic panel. It's always very interesting to see what's going to come out in the future. I work for Synchron, founded the company about 10 years ago, and we're developing an endovascular brain-machine interface, a device that goes through blood vessels to access the brain. So invasive surgery, removing the skull is not required. We finished a human clinical trial in Australia last year, and we're well on our way in implanting a number of Americans with ALS or AMD, diseases that are progressive and essentially prevent the participants over time from using their hands and then using their voices, and they continue to deteriorate. One thing that's been that we've shown is that even with a simple device like ours, these people are able to regain some independence of their lives through using digital means, using computers to communicate or email or surf the web and perform different activities. What's going to be interesting is obviously the future, right? Where does it go from here? And obviously there's a regulatory pathway we need to follow, but these people are going to start wanting more than computers, and they might want to control robotic limbs or wheelchairs and vehicles. It'll get to the stage where it's progressed, and perhaps they can control their own limbs if they've still got them. And I think the interesting point will be in the future is at what stage do consumers or people that don't want to use this for medical technologies, when do they sort of cut in and say, this technology is safe and good enough? Now I'm interested in getting one, even though I don't have a underlying medical condition. And I'd love to hear what the other panelists think about that, and when the time is right, and what needs to be shown before it becomes, if it does, which I think it will, if it does become sort of open to the general public. But I think it's a fantastic field, and the panel here is excellent. So I look forward to hearing all your comments. Thank you for having me.
That was very thought-provoking, Nicholas. Thank you. I mean, the idea of deliberately augmenting yourself, even if you're not trying to make up for some deficiency, is extremely interesting. And we know that historically that's what people have done in the past. They've augmented themselves, whether it's tattoos or shaping of various body parts in various ways that are deliberate. Well, that's certainly thought-provoking, to say the least. Maryam, could I ask you to join us for your opening remarks?
Great. So thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here with everyone. So I'll take more of a system conceptual computational view of BCI. So as you may know, traditionally BCIs have focused on sensory motor deficiencies and restoring movement. And there's a lot of work to be done there. But I view kind of a next generation of BCIs that would instead try to target more high-level states, like cognitive and emotional states, for regulation of abnormal affective states, let's say in depression. And there are multiple computational problems that come up that are distinct from what we used to have in the motor decoding domain. In particular, these more cognitive, emotional states have a distributed representation. We don't even know where they're represented, which part of the brain, which region of the brain. We have to resort to more distributed network modeling. So there's a lot of machine learning challenges that we have to address as we go towards these more complex states and trying to infer them and decode them from multi-regional brain activity. So that's one side of the challenge. The other challenge that's completely orthogonal, this decoding challenge, is the regulation challenge. So at the end of the day, if somebody has, say, depression, you want to regulate that depressed mood state, for example. And this brings up the question of control. How do we adjust an input to the brain, which could be a neuromodulation input, in order to normalize and regulate these abnormal states? So we used to deal primarily with decoding problems in the context of motor BCIs. We now not only have to solve potentially more complex decoding problems, but also an orthogonal problem, which is the regulation and control problem. And I think there's a lot of exciting areas to work on those fronts.
Boy, you've really given us food for thought, Maryam. I'm thinking now about so many ways in which brain malfunction leads to a variety of serious consequences, epilepsy being an obvious example of that. Our ability to do deep brain stimulation, for example, to deal with Parkinson's, are kind of gross examples of our ability to try to manipulate brain state in order to provide a benefit. So you're pushing us, since we're trying to look 20 years ahead, I think you're saying we could be much more sophisticated than we are today. Binhe, I think you're the last panelist to join us. So please, we're asking people for just a few minutes of opening framing thought in the space of direct brain interfaces.
Thank you. If I may, I want to share 3 slides among my brief comments.
Okay, we can see them.
Can you see? Okay. So I wish to make a 2 points. First of all, I would like to share my observation about where we are. I'm focusing on non-invasive direct brain interfacing or brain-computer interface. So this is really taken from a recent textbook, and to illustrate that we could use all non-invasive, invasive recording, and we could extract feature to help humans for replace, restore, enhance, supplement, or improve motor function. And actually, I want to show this video, which is taken from my lab. Now, it's 10 years ago. We were able to fly a drone just using non-invasive brain-computer interface. This subject wearing an EEG cap, clearly not very state-of-art, but a classic EEG cap. We're able to control a device. Now, another is a few years ago, we demonstrate that similarly using EEG cap, again, and very messy, many sensors. And this subject, we're able to control this robotic arm to trace a randomly moving object on the computer screen. So this is really what some of the example where we are in terms of what a non-invasive and BCI could do. Now, the second point of observation I wish to share, because as a moderator asked us, say, what in 20 years from now? What is a non-invasive brain-computer interface or direct brain communication interfacing is going to look like? And one is I see this EEG cap is going to be changed. They will be much more convenient. It could be just a conventional, you wear a lot of these hats. You could put one of the hat is going to very easily capture the signals. That's one. Another is there would be probably a lot of machine learning, and particularly there's a lot of recent development in deep learning AI technique that is going to greatly enhance this decoding and aspect. The last point I wish to share is even though this motor prosthesis BCI work has started to help disabled patient, but really we don't have the limiting to patients who are paralyzed or disabled. The BCI could come to our life in 20 years. It could be everywhere. And people could just enjoy now these days. You could enjoy your smartphone. It doesn't matter which company you make it. Virtually everybody has one. The BCI could become such kind of assistive device that you could control the TV channel. You could turn on the microwave. You could do whatever things in your home and in your office with one of the additional tool to help us what we commonly do as of today. Thank you.
Well, now you've terrified me, to be quite frank. And the reason for this is that I'm imagining that controlling things by thinking about them, while it sounds utterly exciting and enabling, especially for someone with physical disabilities, what happens if you unintentionally cause something to happen because the system that's interpreting your brain state has decided that you decided to do something when in fact all you were doing was wool gathering? So I always worried about the pilot brain interface in the aircraft when the pilot inadvertently thinks of something and the plane takes a nosedive. So our ability to trigger intent or signal intent may turn out to be important for the same reason that the devices like Google Home and Alexa and Siri have trigger words in order to make sure that the system knows that we have an intent to do something. So that's going to be an interesting challenge, I think. I want to test the panel on a particular question, and any of you who wish to respond, if you'll raise your hand or something, or just jump in. It's my belief, and you can now correct me if you like, that our ability to understand how the brain works is best done right now on the sensory neural side of things and sensory motor side of things, because those sensory systems are accessible to us. That's less so for taste and smell than it is for hearing and sight. But our ability to get access to the neurons that are part of that system means that we can understand how the signals work, how they are modulated, how the brain interprets those signals, and then we can emulate them if necessary in order to augment capability. And again, the cochlear implant being a striking example of that. If I'm correct about that, do you think that our primary successes will come along the sensory neural and sensory motor plane over the next 20 years, as opposed to cognitive interfaces, which still seem to be very weak signals with very limited, let me use the word, vocabulary? So who would like to debate that?
Sure, I can provide an answer. I mean, I think firstly, going back to your airplane example, I think the future is, well, some of the future's here now, right? And if a pilot falls asleep, then it's the computer that auto-corrects the human. So perhaps that's the way of going forward with some of these home devices as well.
Nicholas, I apologize for interrupting. It's not very nice of me, but
please.
I cannot resist this joke that says that the airplanes of the 2030s will have a pilot and a dog. The dog will be there to keep the pilot from touching anything, and the pilot is there to feed the dog. That's it. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Never know. No, you could be right. Could be very right. I do think there's going to be a lot of work done on so some neurological conditions like epilepsy. I mean, that's being done already, and depression and Parkinson's, like you mentioned. So I think the whole brain is being looked at in very different aspects and areas. I think the easy ones to understand is something like epilepsy. There's an event, which is a seizure, and you can see whether it's happened quite clearly or not. And then you know if you're providing a therapy to treat that. Things like depression and OCD and other conditions like that, they don't have such a very obvious trigger. And I think that there'll be more time required to understand what the brain's doing to get it to that state before you can try and intervene and reverse it. So I think certainly people are working on those, but I think they're just more difficult problems at the moment, and they have less sort of feedback for the researchers and engineers trying to understand and accommodate it. I'll pass on to one of the others. I see a few hands up.
Yes, quite a few hands up. I'm not quite sure in which order, but I think Max had his hand up first, and that will go Max, Nataliya, and Maryam. So Max, you're on.
Thanks. I'll be brief. I think it's true that it's definitely true that we know most about sensory motor programming in the brain, but I don't know that that's just because those cells are easier to access. Like if you're going into the skull, then like you're in the brain, you can put a probe almost anywhere. But I think the more fundamental thing there is that the representations in somatic sensation and in motor control are just easier for us to understand, right? Because they're closer to the environment. And then it's like the representation in the photoreceptors is a bitmapped image. It's super simple. The representation in the ganglion cells is a lot weirder. It's like this latent space that embeds over some edge detection and colors and other things. And then you go to visual cortex, and then a couple synapses later, and you're in these enormously complicated high dimensional vector spaces that are very hard for us to reason about. And so I think it's that as you move like synapse by synapse deeper into the brain, the representations get more and more abstract, more and more, larger and larger. And so I think that's like the real reason why it's just like harder for us to reason about these higher level cognitive things. And I think that it might prove to be really difficult. I think certainly at the circuit level, it's also possible that like there's a divergence between neuroscience and neural engineering, and we don't need to know all of this in like the single unit detail like neuroscience is done traditionally. And this is a thing where you can use like modern AI, like deep learning models to say like learn, like have the brain co-adapt to a model, and you don't actually need to understand like what this particular cell in like the thalamus is doing. But yeah, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think the state space gets really, really big as you get deeper into cognitive brain function. This constellation of connectivity is just stunning. Nataliya.
Yeah, I guess picking up real quick, I see all the hands are being raised, building up upon what Max and Mick said. On cognitive side of things, it's also very important to note, that historically how, BCI, so brain sensing research at least was developing, we definitely have just less data. We need to understand that. We have our users, usually at least up to very recently being at the lab for 1 hour, 2 hours, or sometimes you will pay them for like overnight, 2-3 weeks. But I think, honestly, we don't have that much data altogether. And what we have is very, very artificial. Let's be very honest, those tasks, those batteries of tasks that, folks present here on the panel, I can see, very, very familiar faces in the panel, like above the screen. They would all agree. But what we are craving and what hopefully will happen, and honestly, COVID was, if for anything positive, that was a good, and I would say amazing push, at least at lab. I can talk about MIT and Media Lab, about our research, but I think with others, we try to now push these systems out of the lab to collect data in the wild. Meaning that in the wild that, you come as you are as you are, you are jet lagged, you are tired, you are right now all focused on this amazing presentation, you are having your little snack. Is this data perfect? No. Is it what we call noisy data? Sure. Is it going to be half of it maybe needs to be trashed altogether because you just cannot, save it? Oh, of course. But when you have terabytes of data per user on everyday basis, this, and enhancing with AI, obviously, this will not by any means. This is not, it's not comparable to perfect 1 or 2 hours of perfect recording at the lab. This will outbeat any lab recording. And more importantly, this is real data. Not that lab data is fake, by no means, of course, that is not. And depending, on your claim, you always need to maybe start with, hardcore lab study. But if you're looking for cognitive functions, if you're looking to understand attention, performance, stress, cognitive load, it's not going to be only MOT and back, etc. All of those like trailing tasks that you need to go. No. Put a user in doing 2 workshops and babysitting at the same time. Put a user in a real condition and record that data for real. And obviously hardware, which we in part talking here, it's tricky. It's tricky to do. Signal processing will be tricky, but that's what we are here to solve. This is kind of my 2 cents. I'm going to stop here to let everyone else comment.
Thank you very much. Well, I think the idea that we might be able to develop sensors that will let us capture people doing normal things instead of putting them in an MRI machine and asking them to artificially think about something will at least allow us to collect a lot more data. Hopefully we'll be able to analyze it. Maryam, you're next.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that while these states are more complex, we've actually made progress on them. So for example, we had a paper published a couple of years ago showing that we can decode how mood changes over time from human EEG activity, intracranial activity. And it wasn't that the state space was really large. Actually, we could do it reasonably well with low dimensional states. I think the challenge in these conditions, as Nataliya said, is if we don't have enough data. And I would argue it's not just the neural data. Actually, the problem with these states is that you do not observe them. It's not like a movement or a tremor that you can measure. You can't measure mood even behaviorally. So I think even sparse behavioral measurements is one thing that has limited our modeling. As we go to more naturalistic measurements of behavioral physiological markers, combine them with neural markers, I think we can indeed decode them, and we have shown proof of concept of that. Further, we've already shown proof of concept that you can use neuromodulation to actually regulate some of these symptoms. There's beautiful proof of concept demonstrations. So I would say that while these are more complex states, we haven't looked at them as much as motor states, and that does not imply we cannot make progress. I do believe we can make reasonable progress within the next 5 to 10 years. There's already very nice proof of concept demonstrations, and I think data is one bottleneck. As we get more sophisticated in measuring these states behaviorally, physiologically, and neurally, I'm very hopeful we can make progress.
I'm going to come back to the question of capturing the signal, so to speak, but I want to let Vint add his remarks. Where did Bin go? Are you there? Where did you?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. To add one brief observation here, I think that it's a very important question that we should do more than sensory motor brain-computer interfacing, then moving to the cognitive side. But actually, as far as they are using, I use a non-invasive EEG, but the non-invasive EEG, the electrophysiology has been very well established. For example, one of the typical this EEG signal being used in BCI is so-called P300. It was initially started from cognitive neuroscience and psychology. So there's all the tools there, but I think really what make this field moving forward is a recognition of the importance to move from sensory motor interfacing towards this cognition-based. I mean, we do have technical scientific background there and tools there, but the recognizing more, we should go. That is important in my opinion. Thank you.
So this is a specific question, I think, to Bin and maybe to Maryam. I imagine that what's going on in the more complex neural structures of the brain are in some ways hidden by a lot of other signals that are propagating all the time. And the brain seems to be continually generating signals. And in fact, it gets upset if it isn't generating those signals. So the things that we're interested in may be very weak signals, and the ability to discern them, to detect them, and extract them from what might otherwise be considered noise strikes me as being very difficult. So with the EEG cap, for instance, um, what can you tell us about our ability over time to extract the interesting signals from the sort of the general background firing of neurons in the brain? And Vint, I'll start with you, and then Maryam, perhaps you could respond. And I'm not trying to inhibit Nicholas and Nataliya by any means. So please go ahead.
This is a great question. And actually, it was not thought a possibility using EEG to detect the signal generated by our thought. But over the past 20 years, it has already demonstrated that even from EEG signals, we are able to reject a vast amount of the background noise or background signal, but pick up the information. And with all these various spatial, spectral, temporal filters. And to give you one example is like the sensory motor reason brain-computer interface work we have been doing is in our lab is the signal we're able to pick up is a microvolt level. The microvolt level, which is actually even smaller than many of the evoked potential signals, which is these days, it is possible. It is possible. Of course, in our work, we use this even related to desynchronization and the model, which is a kind of signal processing. Certainly, there are many, many other ways as well. So it is currently possible to pick up extremely weak signal associated with our thought. That's my brief comment.
They are, of course, extremely transient. And so one of the questions that arises is which of the sequence of signals is what is telling us what the brain is doing. And so capturing those in the transient brief period that they exist seems still to be a big challenge. So Maryam.
So yeah, so this is again a great question. So as you're alluding to, the signals we record are a mixture of a lot of things that are happening. Maybe partly my emotions, maybe how hungry I am, how thirsty I am, what I'm doing with my arm. So the question is, how do we dissociate and disentangle those elements in the signal that relate to the state we're studying? And there's ways to do this actually on the computational side. So we actually have, for example, developed methods that can try to directly extract that common and shared latent space between a behavior you're studying and the neural data so that you can actually do that disentanglement. So I think there are ways to develop novel learning algorithms that can also help alleviate this concern.
Nicholas, I don't know whether you didn't have your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to react to that or not.
No, look, I agree. I think there's obviously a lot going on in the brain, a lot to try and decipher and understand. I was just thinking about how, we obviously pick up a lot of signals that we consider noise, and I wonder how that's going to progress in the future, sort of similar to the way they've mapped the human genome and there's all this junk DNA, and as they learn more, they realize, that's not actually
right.
Junk. That's sort of important. So I imagine as we get better, as we get more data and understand it, then we can say, what we had called noise is actually pretty important for this over here, and how can we use it? And I think a lot of that, will just come with time and getting enough information and learning what to do with it. But it's going to be exciting to see what else we uncover.
So just on this point, it's my understanding, which could be weak and wrong, that in an absolutely silent environment, like an anechoic chamber or something, when your brain is not sensing any sound, it generates its own, or it does something to keep the neurons going. It's almost as if you need to have a certain minimum level of neural activity for the brain to be turning over, to like the engine has to keep running. Am I remembering this correctly, that there is this sort of minimum requirement that it self-generates if it doesn't get any input?
You're probably right. I can't imagine anyone here on the panel who's ever not been thinking. I mean, I think the people you've chosen would be inundated with thoughts all the time. So perhaps that's not the right population group, but I'm sure you're correct. I haven't done that experiment myself.
Well, of course, we do know that sensory deprivation does cause some very peculiar things to happen. People begin to hallucinate and they do other kinds of odd things. And so it just reinforces my layman's imagining that our brains need stimulus in order to function properly. So I guess, are there things that you wish that you could do today that you can't do that would make a big difference in terms of either your research or your attempts to pursue brain interfaces? What kinds of things are barriers to your progress? And so I'll take any people in any order, or I can just call on you. But are there any volunteers? What is it that you can't do today that you wish you could do that would make a difference in your own work? Not seeing any hands up. Max?
Paradoxically for us, we're not the things that limit us are usually infrastructure and logistics. Like we published a paper a week or two ago showing some validation of our visual prosthesis in rabbits. We'd love to include behavior, ideally in monkeys, rather than doing these rabbit cortical recordings as verification. But this has been held up in city permitting for primate housing construction for a little while. And so it really is these routine. Wow. It's not, the bottlenecks are not where people think that they are, at least for me, for the most part. I'd imagine that but we are in a very fortunate situation that we're not primarily funding limited. But it's things like it's taken 6 months to get our hazmat gas cabinets installed, so I can install some new tools so that we can etch tighter materials, so that we can miniaturize some things. Or we have monkeys waiting for us in Florida, waiting on housing to get installed so we can get them so we can do behavior. So it's really those practical logistics, infrastructure stuff that is just often hard to do these days.
Thank you for that. So regulatory constraints are turning out to be the big barrier, not some deep technological thing. Are there other comments on barriers before I go on to my next topic?
I mean, honestly, just jumping in here, hardware is just a disaster, infrastructure-wise. Talked about legislation, but yeah, I mean, you're laughing, but I always recommend, anyone who try to build a hardware of any variable, non-invasive, invasive, it's millions getting into billions, infrastructure-wise, ensuring, the compliances, and it is very, very tough. We saw that a lot of, current companies actually closing up their shops, and there's, obviously a reason to that. So it is actually very tough to release hardware, regardless of what type, invasive or non-invasive, and not only legislation-wise, even if your RBs are approved, you do not need to do surgery, like in our case. That always takes, a huge toll on you. It's the cycle of actually delivering. It's very harsh. So I would say that you cannot underestimate the cost, the human, cost of actually building that and then testing it and then delivering it, to the hands of the users. So I would say that this is something definitely, and obviously COVID didn't help with, the manufacturing, with the infrastructure, with the chips are definitely, we see all of these issues.
A quick comment to add to, in addition to hardware, I think this challenge in the software. It's not just a programming coding per se, but it's more how we could decode the neural information from whatever measurement that we can obtain. Particularly, it's challenging for non-invasive signal, such as EEG, as what we discussed. It's more noisy, it's more difficult. But even with invasive recording, just we think about if you get a million point, which is virtually very difficult, right? You get a million point invasive recording in the brain, but still we need to turn that invasive recording or non-invasive recording into the neural codes, into what a person is thinking, what is the mind, and not to mention if you want to look at a cognitive level. So I think that is currently we cannot do. But I really wish that can be done. I'm not saying in 20 years we're going to solve this problem, but I think definitely there will be big jump that we're able to do much, much more than what we're able to do at this time.
So unless somebody wants to jump on that question, I want to move on to another related topic. It has to do with sensing. One thing which I have recently learned is that quantum sensing is a very interesting new area because it's producing much, much more sensitive ability to detect signals. And I have no idea whether we use that for a lot of physical sensing where we're like the infrared signals that we're getting out of the James Webb Telescope and other kinds of sensors for the physical sciences. But is the ability to detect a weak signal an inhibitor right now? And do we need to develop new methods for detecting what's going on inside the brain? So I see people nodding, but then the question will be, well, what is it that we should be trying to do or should be pursuing that looks fruitful that we haven't done yet?
To jump in really quickly, so most of BCI traditionally has been metal capacitive electrodes, placing electrodes either on the surface of the head within a EEG cap, or depth electrodes or ECOG, a surface around the brain. But these are detecting, it's detecting either an electric field or a capacitive, like a charge concentration gradient change. I think my impression, having spent a lot of time looking at the physics, is that there are going to be fundamental limits to what we can do. But that doesn't mean that it's binary, right? That's not at all to say that EEG or non-invasive is not worthwhile. There's a lot that you can do. It's just that these provide different signals, which will be useful for different products. And when we think about something like EEG, it's really, I think, important to understand physically what we're looking at. There's these big cortical oscillations that are the activity of millions of cells. And it's that synchronized activity that's being picked up on the surface. And it's really tough in many ways to think about. I mean, there's some scattering through the skull. You can't really do tricks like using a phased array to get antenna gain to reach into the noise floor, which is the thing people talk about, because that, like, the key frequency there is about 1 kilohertz, and that your antenna for that is hundreds of kilometers, which isn't practical. And so I'm really personally excited about improvements that require more on the biology lift for interfacing with the brain. Now, this is much more invasive rather than less invasive. And so this is not going to be the whole story for everybody, but things like optogenetics, things like biohybrid biohybrid devices where you use engineered neurons, things like optical interfaces, I think are going to be a big part of scaling to hundreds of thousands or millions or billions of channels. I think that there are going to be real fundamental limits to what you can do, especially non-invasively. But that's not to say that it's not worthwhile. It's just going to be different products.
Fascinating. Yeah, you're right. Optogenetics is particularly interesting since it makes visible what's going on. It's a different kind of detector than having to plug a sensor physically into the neuron. We have a whole bunch of different questions here. And so here's an interesting one from Jessica Dunn. She says, does the difficulty in interfacing with executive function relate to evolution? And she goes on to say, neural pathways to the occipital lobe are more straightforward than the cortex. Well, that's an interesting question. Anybody care to react to that? I have no idea how to connect is there an evolutionary benefit to protecting certain parts of the brain from trauma or access somehow than the others? I have no idea. I'm not sure anybody else does. Okay, well, we'll go on to some other alternative questions. Okay, we had many comments about heading towards deeper interactions than sensory motor. But what's the ground truth for mood and cognitive states? Beyond sleep states, alpha waves, for instance, how can we standardize such cognitive function across people? Okay, so that's interesting. Is there anything that I'm going to try to translate this into something I pretend to understand. Is there anything common about looking at the EEG or across multiple parties, across different people. Is there something in common that we recognize?
Yeah, I mean, I see that we are running out of time, but super quick in under 1 minute. Of course, there are common things, but also there are very different things. That's the beauty. So it's like a lot of studies. I would suggest looking into, hyperscanning, going through maybe similar battery of tasks or experiences, where you would have people literally in sync, even prior their experience starting. I think Vint, you mentioned like earlier on, extreme environments, sensor deprivation. Those are actually also excellent candidates, extreme environments, like, underwater experiences, etc., mountains. All of those are all great candidates to see similarities. If you want to measure some similarities, you also would pick up, a similar battery of tasks for a similar category of users. You would take users or subjects, as we call them, that have similar background, age group, sex, and that all would actually matter. And that's why we're reporting on all of those. There's much more to say about this, but also ground truth is ultimately, a lot about personalization, ultimate personalization, depending on your state at this moment, as I mentioned in the very beginning. I'm going to stop here because we don't have a lot of time. Maybe someone else needs to add a point.
Well, we actually have about 9 minutes left, believe it or not. We get to go to 3:05. Because of the 10-minute breaks in between these sessions, the clock is sort of drifting into interesting spaces.
I'll add one point to that. So for a lot of these things, the ground truth is essentially self-reports. For example, if you're assessing mood or some mental state, you basically ask the person what they feel. That is our ground truth, as we cannot observe their more high-level, like say, mood states or cognitive states. But this is very, very limiting. And so there is this idea that maybe we can go to more continuous, richer behavioral measures, such as audio-facial expressions, for example, to assess some of these states. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
We have one other question here, which is an observation anyway. It's from Vijaya Lakshmi Subramani. I think I got that sort of right. She says, or he, I'm not sure which, we work with children with special needs and VR. I have felt that the children who have a high level of stimmings and hand or head movements when they use VR 360 videos, especially moving videos, their stimming reduces. And so it looks like VR immersive experience is tricking the brain that they're moving, but in real life they're not moving, and it stops them from hurting themselves physically. So that's a rather interesting observation about the use of virtual reality in order to fool the brain into thinking something is happening when it isn't. So there's another question that's come from Andreas Forsland. He says, can you talk about what the future looks like with a combination of invasive and wearable brain-computer interfaces together? So, mixing those two modalities. For example, a child with a cochlear implant combined with augmented reality glasses and an EEG sensor. So are these combination of sensing systems likely to produce something fruitful?
I might just put a comment in there. Just firstly, I think it's amazing how many different technologies are coming out. And my hat certainly goes off to all those on the panel and everyone else working in this field, because I know your hearts are in the right place trying to help different people, kids or adults with various conditions. And I think it's going to be amazing to see how these modalities are used in the future. There are going to be different people who can benefit from one or other or multiple prosthetic devices or wearables or implants. And I think to the comment or question by the review, I mean, we need your help. Tell us how we can put them all together. Like there's so much that can be done. So I think it's an amazing space. And I'm sure there certainly is times where you can use VR to help this condition and use it with cochlear implants as well to help them understand what they might be hearing while they're hearing it. And And I think it's fascinating. So I'm very excited.
So I'm going to.
Sorry, Nataliya, I know you were about to speak. I cut you off, so apologies.
Oh
No,
yeah,
no.
real
Go ahead.
fast. It's more of it's what I mentioned at the beginning. We would start enhancing and mixing those that exist already. Like as I mentioned in the beginning, cochlear implants, lenses. Think about even like I don't know, teeth implants. Why not? This is invasive, but you can get easier enhancement, more acceptable enhancement, easier on the body. But it will enhance one ability, one thing, one function, possibly just one to start with. Maybe additional hearing. You would hear sounds, that you usually would not hear, as some animals do, etc. You might, taste something that you would not be able to taste, or on the opposite, not actually feel, some pain, etc. Same for smell. So I think that the beauty of these interfaces, they are already acceptable. They are those beam surgeries. They are, I would say, more commonplace, if I would allow. Not that they are common, but they are common. They are much more accessible than, very expensive surgeries on the brain that would require a lot of rehabilitation still, and they do have more risks. And that, I think, is definitely a next step for kind of mixing those together, and then you would have, kind of an enhancement going outside, like letting you know about some information, and that will make it a closed loop. So this is just like 2 cents from me.
So the interesting thing about this line of reasoning is that we go beyond restoring function to augmenting function, in effect. And we do this artificially anyway. I mean, you can put on a headset, for example, and use an X-ray system to translate down from the X-ray level to visual wavelengths so that you can actually see, but as if you had X-ray eyes and things like that. So there are all kinds of augmentation possibilities here. I want to flip this around in the last couple of minutes, though, and ask you to consider the possibility that we deliberately generate signals that we inject into the brain for purposes of trying to do something useful, let's hope. But we've learned that, for example, in CRISPR-Cas9, it's very exciting to be able to edit the DNA and to have either transient or permanent effect on the genome. The problem that we've discovered is that even with that level of precision, it sometimes clips the wrong thing and sticks, a sequence where it doesn't belong. Do you imagine that our attempts to artificially stimulate the brain in a direct way might have the side effect of creating a condition that we didn't intend? And I wonder how careful do we have to be about that?
I think it's possible. I think a lot of these things will be transient. I mean, you can see already that, from the work done with epilepsy, the signal might not be perfect, but they're just sort of shooting in some electric current and hoping to stop the seizure. Now, as we learn more, that'll get better and better. Is there a way that you can inject a signal so that the brain knows not to have any seizures at all? And then, like your point on the flip side is there a possibility you put something in and someone who doesn't have seizures might have them?
Right.
That's possible, but whether there's something that can stick around permanently, I guess we'll see. But I think the brain's pretty amazing at being adaptable, and hopefully we can just come up with the right codes to help it on its way.
Well, it's certainly true that brain flexibility, what is the right word for this? I'm sorry, I just drew a blank.
Neuroplasticity.
Yeah, plasticity, thank you. Is a well-defined or at least well-known effect. I've seen this work. It's with my wife's cochlear implants in particular. It's astonishing how the brain is able to adapt to weak or imperfect signals to figure out what it is that it should be sensing. Well, we are essentially out of time. Let me thank every one of you on the panel, not only for today's discussion, but for the work and research that you're doing. In the long term, I think that you will be contributing significantly to our ability to make use of our brains better and to recover from various and sundry kinds of disabilities. So I want to thank you for your time and your work. I'll turn this back to Greg, and we'll take another, I think, 10-minute break.